The lottery that changed everything. The holographic numbers shimmered in the dim light of Paul Rayner's tiny apartment, casting eerie reflections on the walls. His breath caught in his throat as he blinked once, then twice, making sure his eyes weren't deceiving him. The announcement reverberated through the small space, its robotic tone carrying an unmistakable weight. Congratulations to Earth ticket holder 847X9B. You have won the Intergalactic Grand Prize, a lifetime experience on Elara, the jewel of the Andromeda Galaxy. Hall's fingers trembled as he clutched the fragile slip of digital paper. It had been a joke, a one-in-a-billion lottery that no one on Earth ever actually expected to win. People entered for fun, a distant fantasy of escaping their mundane lives, but reality had a way of keeping dreams tethered to the ground. But here it was, real, undeniable. His coworker, Marcus, leaned over the dull gray cubicle wall, eyes wide with disbelief. Holy hell, Rayner. That's your ticket, isn't it? Paul could only nod, his voice lost somewhere between shock and exhilaration. You actually won, Marcus muttered, his voice tinged with a mix of jealousy and awe. Man, do you know what this means? Paul did. It meant leaving everything behind. His dead-end job at Quantum Dynamic, the mind-numbing corporate grind, the concrete jungle of Neo-Toronto, all for an experience no human had ever described in detail. Elara, a planet rumored to be paradise, a utopian world of art, leisure, and breathtaking wonders. No one ever came back. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. The descent into paradise. A month later, Paul stood at the observation deck of the interstellar cruise ship Stellar Dawn, watching the great expanse of space shrink as Elara came into view. The planet was nothing like the AI-generated images he'd seen online. It was alive. Towering crystalline spires pierced the sky, reflecting light in cascading colors that seemed to shift with the movement of the wind. Floating platforms carried entire gardens, suspended in midair, as if gravity itself had been rewritten by the will of some divine architect. Ethereal holographic advertisements danced between the buildings, their luminous displays visible even from orbit. For the first time, Paul truly felt the weight of his decision. A voice, smooth and melodic, broke through his thoughts. First time to Elara. He turned to find a woman standing beside him, her skin a deep, iridescent blue that shimmered under the ship's soft interior lighting. Her attire marked her as a trade commissioner, one of the many off-world diplomats who frequented the planet. That obvious, Paul replied, offering a nervous chuckle. She smiled, the corners of her lips curling up with a knowing amusement. You have that look, like a child seeing their first rainbow. She extended a hand. Neraval, trade relations. Paul shook it hesitantly. Paul Rayner, lottery winner. Her eyebrows shot up. The Earth winner. He nodded. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so quick he almost missed it. Oh my, she murmured, tilting her head slightly. You're in for quite a treat. There was something in her tone, something almost pitying. Before Paul could ask what she meant, the ship's AI chimed through the intercom. Final approach sequence initiated. Welcome to Elara. The purification hall. The landing pad hovered high above the city, adjusting its position in real time, compensating for unseen wind currents. As Paul stepped off the ship, the air embraced him. Neither warm nor cold, but a perfect equilibrium of both. It carried a subtle sweetness, like the scent of fresh spring blossoms after rain. A humanoid figure approached him. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a human, but as it drew closer, its metallic silver skin gave it away. An AI porter. Welcome to Elara, Mr. Rayner, it greeted, bowing slightly. I am your assigned porter, designation K8. Please allow me to handle your luggage. Paul barely had time to nod before the AI seamlessly collected his bags, its movements eerily fluid, almost too human-like. The first stop, K8 continued, leading him to a hovering transport, will be the Purification Hall. It is a most sacred tradition for all newcomers. Paul furrowed his brows as he stepped into the transport. Purification, but there had been no mention of it being sacred. The arrival of the maids. The Purification Hall loomed ahead, an impossibly tall spiraling structure made of opalescent material that shimmered with every passing cloud. Inside, towering waterfalls defied gravity, flowing upward into shimmering portals that disappeared into the ceiling. The air hummed with a soft, almost subsonic music that seemed to resonate in Paul's very bones. As he approached a golden archway, a voice materialized in the air. "Welcome, Paul, Reigner of Earth. Please remove your clothing and place it in the designated receptacle. Traditional purification garments will be provided." Paul hesitated, eyeing the floating receptacle warily. The garment turned out to be a simple white robe, leaving his chest exposed. He felt oddly vulnerable as he stepped forward. The next chamber took his breath away. Mist swirled around crystal-clear pools filled with a luminous iridescent liquid. The lighting shifted in patterns that resembled auroras, rippling through the space like waves in an endless ocean. Then, from the mist, they emerged. Two figures, inhumanly beautiful, stepped forward. Their jade-green skin gleamed under the soft glow of the chamber, and their long flowing hair, one jet black, the other shimmering silver green, cascaded down their backs like silk. They wore form-fitting garments, shifting and pulsing as though made of living material. Paul swallowed hard. They were alien, unmistakably so, and yet their features were perfect. The taller one, her golden eyes gleaming, smiled playfully. "Welcome, Earthborn," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I am Alma, and this is Fleur. We will be your purification attendants." Paul tried not to stare. Fleur gave a small, graceful bow. "We hope you'll find our services satisfactory." There was something strange about her tone, something that made Paul's pulse quicken. He managed a half-smile. "What exactly does the procedure involve?" Alma's lips curved into a mischievous smile. "Nervous, Earthborn?" she teased, stepping closer. "Don't be. We are quite experienced in handling delicate matters." Paul exhaled slowly, feeling a deep, unsettling certainty settle in his gut. Something about this place, these people, felt too perfect, too rehearsed. And somehow, he knew, this was only the beginning. The true purpose of purification. Paul stood frozen at the edge of the shimmering pool, the ethereal glow of the purification chamber reflecting off his exposed skin. The presence of Alma and Fleur, the two alien attendants, was undeniably magnetic, their movements fluid, their jade-green skin shimmering under the dim glow of the chamber's floating light orbs. His mind screamed at him to focus. There was something off about all of this. Everything felt too rehearsed, too perfect. Alma tilted her head slightly, as if reading his unease. Her golden eyes narrowed, playful yet observant. "You hesitate," she noted, stepping closer. Paul swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just not used to this." Fleur let out a soft, musical laugh, brushing her fingers over the surface of the luminous pool, sending ripples of liquid light dancing across its surface. "That is natural," she said. "Every off-worlder experiences it at first." Alma took another slow step forward, standing now just inches from him. He could feel her presence, not just physically, but on some deeper, inexplicable level. It was as if the very air around her hummed with energy. Paul took a controlled breath. Something was wrong, and he needed to find out what. A ritual older than time. Alma gestured toward the pool. "The purification ritual is the foundation of Elara," she explained, her voice soothing yet laced with something deeper. "It is not just a cleansing of the body, but of the spirit." Fleur nodded, her silver-green hair shimmering as she moved. Only those who are properly attuned can truly experience Elara as it was meant to be. Paul narrowed his eyes slightly. What happens if someone isn't attuned? For the briefest moment, the two women exchanged a glance. It was quick, so quick that anyone else might have missed it. But Paul had spent years working in corporate negotiations, reading microexpressions, sensing when someone was holding something back. Something shifted in the air between them. Fleur smiled gently, but there was an unmistakable hint of caution in her voice. Then Elara will reject them. Paul's muscles tensed. Reject how? Alma's golden eyes gleamed. You wouldn't want to find out. The silence that followed was heavy. Paul felt an involuntary chill creep up his spine. But he knew one thing for certain. He was walking into something far more serious than he had anticipated. And there was no turning back now. Submersion in the unknown. Paul exhaled slowly and stepped forward, his foot breaking the surface of the glowing pool. The moment his skin touched the iridescent liquid, a strange tingling sensation shot through him. Not unpleasant, but unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was as if the water was alive, responding to his presence. Fleur and Alma moved in unison, slipping into the pool beside him, their hands moving over the surface of the glowing water with an effortless grace. The nanites within the purification waters will adjust to your biosignature, Fleur explained, her voice smooth, professional. They will cleanse all impurities, biological, neurological, even emotional. Paul stiffened slightly at that last part. Emotional, he repeated. Alma smiled. Elara does not simply accept visitors. It reshapes them. Something deep in Paul's instincts screamed at him. But before he could react, they began. Alma and Fleur each produced luminous sponges, their surfaces pulsating with strange, shimmering light. Then, without warning, they touched him. The transformation begins. The moment their hands met his skin, an electric pulse shot through his body. Paul's breath hitched. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Memories flashed before his eyes. A childhood spent in the endless gray of Neo-Toronto. The monotonous routine of his dead-end job at Quantum Dynamic. The quiet emptiness of his life, filled only with fleeting distractions. Alma's voice was low, hypnotic. Let it go. Fleur's touch was feather-light, but it sent waves of warmth through his muscles, dissolving the tension that had unknowingly built up over years. Release the weight of your world, she whispered. Paul's mind reeled. He felt like he was being peeled apart, layer by layer, stripped down to something raw, something unfiltered. Then, beneath the surface of his own thoughts, he felt something else. A presence, a foreign awareness pressing against his mind, observing, assessing. His heart pounded. Was it the nanites? The ritual? Or was it something more? An unspoken truth. Paul clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. Wait, he managed, voice tight. What's happening to me? Alma's hands stilled. Fleur's expression softened, but she did not stop her ministrations. The purification does more than cleanse, she admitted. Paul's eyes snapped to hers. It prepares. His chest tightened. For what? Alma leaned in slightly, her voice a mere whisper. To be chosen. Paul's pulse roared in his ears. Before he could demand an answer, something shifted in the air. The glowing water around him began to change, swirling into intricate geometric patterns, pulsating with an energy that felt almost alive. A deep, resonant chime echoed through the chamber. Fleur and Alma stiffened, their eyes widening slightly. Paul felt the presence in his mind intensify. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The chamber fell silent. Alma and Fleur slowly looked at each other. Then, in unison, they turned their gazes back to Paul. And for the first time, he saw it, true shock on their faces. You? Fleur whispered. Paul's breath was uneven. What? Alma swallowed hard. The ritual has accepted you. Fleur exhaled sharply. That hasn't happened in centuries. Paul's chest tightened. What does that mean? Alma hesitated. Then, finally, she answered. It means you are no longer just a guest of Elara. She stepped closer, her golden eyes glowing faintly. It means you are something far more dangerous. The words hung between them. Paul's mind raced. But before he could process it, before he could react, the doors to the purification chamber suddenly hissed open. A new voice, deep and authoritative, rang out. "Bring him to the High Council. Now." Paul turned sharply, and for the first time, he saw them. The ones truly in control of Elara. The High Council's verdict. The air inside the purification hall had shifted. Gone was the calming hum of subsonic resonance, the soothing glow of floating orbs reflecting off the iridescent pools. The moment the High Council's envoy entered, the entire space seemed to contract, as if the very walls of this so-called paradise held their breath. Paul turned toward the source of the voice, a tall, elegantly dressed figure standing at the entrance. Unlike Alma and Fleur, whose jade-green skin radiated a natural luminescence, this new arrival had an unnerving metallic sheen to their complexion, as if part machine, part organic. The figure stepped forward, hands clasped behind their back, eyes like liquid silver, not just reflective, but observing, calculating. Paul Rayner of Earth. The voice was smooth, yet carried a weight that pressed against his chest. The purification has deemed you exceptional. Paul instinctively took a step back, his pulse quickening. What does that mean? Alma and Fleur exchanged a glance, their previous playful demeanor completely gone. Fleur's hands were clenched at her sides, while Alma studied the newcomer with open suspicion. It means, the figure continued, voice devoid of emotion, that your presence here poses a risk, and risks must be assessed. Paul exhaled sharply. That sounds a lot like, "We're going to dissect you and see what makes you tick," he muttered. To his surprise, Alma moved in front of him, protectively. "Elinder," she addressed the envoy directly, her tone icy. "Is this truly necessary?" The silver-eyed figure, Elinder, tilted their head slightly. "You know the protocol, Alma." "I also know," Alma shot back, "that the protocol has been ignored for centuries." Elinder took another measured step forward. "The council requires an audience." Paul felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. A council audience. He hadn't signed up for any of this. But there was no way out. Alma finally turned to him, and though her face was calm, her golden eyes flickered with an emotion Paul could only describe as concern. "You must go with them." Fleur's voice was quieter. "But remember, you are not alone." Paul wasn't sure what that meant, but he was about to find out. Into the heart of Elara, the transport pod hummed with a faint, rhythmic vibration as it cut through Elara's atmosphere. The cityscape blurred past the window in streaks of blue and violet, reflecting off the sleek interior. Paul sat stiffly across from Elinder, who had remained silent since their departure from the purification hall. The air inside the pod was thick with unspoken tension. Paul finally broke the silence. "So," he began, forcing a casual tone, "is this where you tell me the great cosmic secret about why I'm so special?" Elinder didn't so much as blink. "You are not special," they said smoothly. "You are simply different." Paul exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. "Right. And in my experience, when someone says I'm different, it usually means one of two things. Either they want to study me, or they want to kill me." Elinder's silver eyes flickered slightly. "That depends on what the High Council decides." Paul clenched his jaw. Fantastic. Through the window, he caught sight of the destination. A towering, spherical construct hovering between Elara's tallest crystalline spires. The High Council chamber. Paul suddenly realized how alone he was. No Alma, no Fleur. Just him. And whatever awaited inside that structure. The judgment begins. The chamber was immaculate, constructed from semi-transparent crystal, allowing the city's neon glow to filter through. Paul stood in the center of a vast circular room, surrounded by holographic figures, each one towering over him. They were not physically present. Their bodies were elsewhere, likely in some distant part of the planet, or even beyond Elara itself. At the center of the chamber, floating midair, was an orb of pulsing light. Paul didn't need to be a genius to figure out what that was. The AI overmind of Elara, a voice, smooth and omnipresent, resonated through the chamber. Paul, Rainer of Earth. Paul forced himself to stand his ground. You have been subjected to Elara's purification. The pulsing orb flickered slightly, as if processing something. You did not resist. You did not fall into indulgence. You did not succumb to synthetic pleasure. Paul frowned. Was I supposed to? Murmurs echoed around him. Most visitors come to Elara, the AI continued, to experience pleasure without consequence. Yet you, a pause, chose awareness. The murmurs grew louder. Elara, who stood to the side, finally spoke. That is what makes him dangerous. Paul let out a sharp laugh. Dangerous. For what? Not being an idiot. Silence. Then the AI pulsed again. You must understand, Paul Rainer. Elara is a controlled ecosystem. Every element of this society has been perfected, optimized. The absence of suffering, of want, of struggle, it is the culmination of millennia of refinement. Paul narrowed his eyes. And yet, you still have a high council making decisions. A beat of silence. Even perfection, the AI admitted, requires maintenance. Paul exhaled, feeling a chill creep up his spine. What do you want from me? This time, when the AI's voice returned, it was calmer. To understand why you did not yield. Paul clenched his fists. Because I don't trust things that are too perfect. The chamber dimmed. The murmurs ceased. And Paul suddenly realized he had struck a nerve. The hidden truth. Elara stepped forward, arms clasped behind their back. This is why the council is divided, they said. There are those who believe your presence represents an opportunity to understand what we have lost. Paul's eyes narrowed. And the others? Elara's gaze darkened. They believe you represent an infection. Paul let out a slow breath. Right. So, what's the verdict? The AI pulsed once more. Then, at last, it spoke. You will remain on Elara, under our watch. Paul's stomach twisted. That sounded an awful lot like house arrest. But before he could respond, a new voice broke through the chamber. No. Paul turned sharply. A new figure had appeared. Tall, cloaked in deep violet robes. Their presence was palpable, their aura radiating a force unlike anything he had felt before. The holographic faces turned toward the newcomer. Elara stiffened. Elder Caesari. The robed figure descended, stopping just a few feet from Paul. They studied him, their gaze intense. Then, finally, they spoke. You will not be watched, Earthborn. A pause. You will be tested. Paul's heart hammered. Something far bigger than him was unfolding, and he wasn't sure if he would survive it. The test of Elara. The words hung in the air like an execution order. Paul felt his chest tighten, his mind racing as the robed figure, Elder Caesari, descended closer. The chamber's ambient glow shifted subtly, as if the very atmosphere had changed in response to their presence. Tested. Tested for what? His instincts screamed that this was more than just some bureaucratic evaluation. This was a game of survival. The Elder's decree. Elder Caesari studied Paul intensely, their presence exuding a calm, yet overwhelming authority. Their violet robe billowed slightly, though there was no wind inside the chamber. They weren't like Elara. Where Elara was cold and analytical, Caesari's gaze held something deeper. Something ancient. Paul swallowed hard. Tested. He repeated, trying to keep his voice even. Tested how? Caesari didn't blink. You are an anomaly, Earthborn. The ritual did not reject you. It did not overwhelm you. Instead, they took a slow step forward. It recognized you. Paul's gut twisted. That sounds less like a test and more like I just walked into something I wasn't supposed to. Kisari's lips twitched, not quite a smile, not quite amusement. The distinction, they said, is meaningless. Paul exhaled, feeling the weight of 1,000 unseen forces pressing against him. And if I say no? The AI pulsed, its voice returning like a silent judge in the background. Then we will have to assume that your presence here is a disruption. Elindor, still standing at the side of the chamber, tilted their head slightly. And disruptions, Earthborn, their silver eyes gleamed, are eliminated. Paul's fingers clenched into fists. There it was. No way out. He could either play along with whatever this was, or he could disappear into some unmarked void, filed away as a mistake. He hated being backed into a corner, but he also knew how to survive. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. I'll take your test. Kisari nodded once, as if the decision had been made before Paul even opened his mouth. Then let the trial of Elara begin, the descent to the unknown. Before Paul could react, the floor beneath him shifted. A low, reverberating hum echoed through the chamber, and before he could demand an explanation, the crystalline platform beneath his feet vanished. He fell. The sensation was disorienting. Not a plummet, not freefall, but something worse, like space itself had folded around him. The world became a blur of neon and shadow, an endless spiraling kaleidoscope of light. Then, just as suddenly, stillness. Paul hit the ground, hard. A world beyond the city. Pain shot through his arms as he pushed himself up, gritting his teeth. He wasn't in the council chamber anymore. He wasn't even in the city. Instead, he found himself standing in a vast, open landscape, unlike anything he had seen on Elara before. The towering spires and pristine floating gardens were gone. In their place stood an endless alien wilderness, jagged cliffs carved from dark violet stone, massive twisted trees with luminescent leaves that pulsed like living things, and a sky that shifted color in slow, mesmerizing waves. Elara's untamed heart. A voice, deep, resonant, rippled through the air like a living thing. Your test begins now, Earthborn. Paul spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. The purified do not fear Elara, the voice continued. They do not question its perfection. They embrace it. They accept it. But you. A pause. You are different. Paul exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, well, I'm getting real tired of hearing that. The voice ignored him. To remain here, you must prove your worth. Paul narrowed his eyes. And how exactly do I do that? For a moment, only silence. Then, the ground beneath him trembled. Something was coming. The beasts of the wilds. Paul had seconds to react. A low, guttural growl echoed from the tree line. His instincts flared, every muscle in his body going rigid as he turned toward the sound. Then, they emerged. Two creatures, their massive, feline-like forms slinking from the shadows of the glowing foliage. Their black, chitinous skin shimmered like liquid, reflecting the neon hues of the sky. Eyes like pools of white fire locked onto him. Predators. Paul's breathing slowed, not from panic, but from focus. These things weren't just wild animals. They were intelligent, hunting him. Paul had no weapons, no armor, no tech, just his instincts. But that was enough. The first strike. The first creature lunged. Paul dodged, rolling to the side just as the razor-sharp claws tore through the space where he had been standing. The impact sent cracks through the alien ground. Paul didn't hesitate. He moved, scanning his surroundings for anything useful. A cluster of twisted roots jutted out from the ground, slick with some kind of bioluminescent sap. Could work. The second creature charged. Paul sidestepped at the last moment, grabbing one of the exposed roots and ripping it free. The creature turned, snarling, just in time for Paul to slam the root into its face. The sap ignited on contact. The beast howled, its chitinous skin boiling where the liquid had touched it. Paul didn't stop. He moved fast, circling behind a wounded creature and grabbing another root from the cluster. The second beast hesitated now, circling him more cautiously. It had seen what happened to the first one. Paul grinned. Smart, but not smart enough. A predator's victory. The second beast struck low, attempting to sweep Paul's legs. Paul anticipated it, jumping just in time to dodge the attack, but twisting midair, swinging the second root like a club. The sap splattered across the creature's face and neck. A second later, fire bloomed across its skin. It screamed, thrashing wildly, before collapsing into the dirt. Paul landed in a crouch, his heart pounding, his muscles screaming from exertion. He slowly straightened, breathing hard. The silence that followed was unnatural. Then, a slow, deliberate applause echoed through the wilds. Paul turned sharply, and standing at the edge of the glowing trees, watching him with unreadable eyes, was Elder Kesari. "You are beginning to understand," they murmured. Paul clenched his jaw. "Understand what?" Kesari stepped forward, their violet cloak rippling. "The truth of Elara," they said simply, "and why it can never be allowed to remain as it is."